Hi everyone, we're back again after a 2-month hiatus. For those that are joining us for the first time, my name is Grace and I overlook all the exciting things here that happen at BenQ. And of course, these are including our webinars. Here I also have my assistant, Aditya, that will also be helping assist. He will assist in the next upcoming sessions while I am on leave. Now, before we get started, I'd like to announce some exciting news we have with Pantone as we are expanding our partnership to provide creators and professional users with an exclusive digital color experience. You can scan the QR code or visit the link, which I'll also include in the chat shortly, so you can view the participating monitors and instructions on how to redeem your 1-year free subscription. It's available to existing owners and also new owners of our selected BenQ range. Now tonight, we'd like to welcome back Joshua Holko for the 4th time, who have just also come back from his travels again. And for those who don't know who Joshua is, he is our multi-award-winning photographer and BenQ ambassador, who also specialises in the polar and subpolar regions of the globe. And as per previous feedback, we have an extended session tonight on the topic of how to post-produce photographs with ice and snow. Taking you through to his full workflow for producing photographs with maximum tone, contrast, and emotional impact. He'll also show you how to get the very best results from your raw files. And there will also be just a brief short discussion on why color calibration and color accuracy is important. And as always, there will also be a Q&A session at the end to address all your queries. But feel free to drop us a question in the chat or the Q&A box, and we'll try to answer it live, or we'll just have to wait until at the end of the session and Joshua will try to get through all those questions for you. So I'll include all the links to Joshua's blog and also his website and also the Pantone Connect campaign. Now over to Joshua.
Thank you, Grace. I hope everybody can see and hear me. So good evening, good morning, good afternoon, wherever you might be at the moment in the world. I just returned myself recently from a 4-month trip overseas, so I'm still catching up on jet lag a little bit, but I'm feeling pretty confident and fresh that this is going to go the way I want it to go today in relation to post-production of images with ice and snow. So I want to do a few things today. I want to, first of all, thank BenQ for generously putting on this webinar. It's a great thrill of mine to be able to share my passion with other photographers and be able to pass on a little bit of what I've learned over the years photographing images with ice and snow, which is primarily what I do. So my thanks to BenQ for that, because it's just great. It's great to be able to share these sessions. So before I get into too much about color calibration, I'm just going to talk very, very briefly about that. I'm going to just share my screen so we can be ready for post-production. So I want to make sure everybody can actually see my screen okay. Now, if anyone can't see Lightroom, please just drop it in the chat and I will do what I can to try and fix it. But hopefully everybody can see that now. I think you should be able to. Just going to double check. If you can't, as I said, please just drop it in the chat for me. But I think everybody can, or just speak up. Just going to quickly check. Yes, everybody can see that. Fantastic. So I'm not going to talk too much, as I said, about color calibration, because the topic of today is really going to be post-production. And one of my colleagues, Ian Vanderwald, who's doing a seminar a little bit later on, is going to talk more about color management. I just simply want to touch on it and say that at the cornerstone of everything that I'm going to show you tonight is that you are working from a color calibrated monitor. And in a known state. So what that means is, in my case, I'm working on 2 monitors here in my studio. I'm working on 2 BenQs. One is the SW321C and one is the SW271C. So they're the upgraded models of the previous 321 and 271. They're full Adobe, basically full Adobe RGB monitors. So they have a very, very wide gamut. And basically all that means is that they're able to display a much broader range of color than you might typically see in a lower end display or in a laptop, for example. And that's really important as photographers, because we want to be able to see as much color as we can. The human eye is actually capable of seeing a lot more color than any display can actually render. So you want to be able to display the biggest bucket of color you possibly can, so you can see what's in your files. And I'm going to show you tonight, actually by way of example, just how much detail and color there is in a file, in a raw file, that you can pull out and you can work with. Because a lot of people really don't realize just how much there actually is in the way of detail that you can pull out of an image. And I'm not just talking about fine detail, I'm talking about color detail as well. So it's very, very important that you are working on a color calibrated display. So in my case here in my studio, I'm working on these two displays. They're both calibrated to D6500, that's 6500 degrees Kelvin. And in my case, they're calibrated to 80 candelas. That's just the brightness rating that works for prints here in my studio. What is important, that number is actually not that important. What is important though is that your monitors are calibrated to a known state. So if you want to know more about this, as I said, this whole seminar is not going to be about color calibration, but if you want to know more about this, get in touch with BenQ, get in touch with myself, drop me an email or BenQ an email, or get onto YouTube and look up color calibration, because it's really the fundamental cornerstone of everything I'm going to show you tonight. So let's move on from color calibration and get into the meat of the topic, which is going to be post-production of images with ice and snow. Now, I want to go through my full workflow. As I said, one of the things I want to talk about initially, and we're going to look at an iceberg image, specifically this one, which is an image I shot recently in Greenland. And I'm just going to move this out of the way so I can see what I'm doing. So this image has already actually had a little bit of tweaking. I'm going to actually just take it over to the develop module in Lightroom, and we will reset the image to the image as I captured it in camera. So there you go. That's the image as I photographed it in camera. And most people's immediate reaction to this when I demonstrate this is that's overexposed. And yes, it is overexposed, but it's very deliberately overexposed. The reason I did this is called exposed to the right. And it's a technique I use an awful lot in my photography to capture low noise images at high ISO and to capture the maximum possible amount of detail that I can in my photographs. Now, although this image looks like it might be blown out or clipped, it's actually not. I've actually turned on the clipping indicators here in the histogram, and if you look up in the top right-hand corner there where the histogram is, you can see that there's actually no clipping. The indicators, the clipping indicators, the shortcut key to turn those on and off in Lightroom, and we're working in Lightroom Creative Cloud, by the way, the latest version, is the J key. So by turning them on, if there had been clipping there in the highlights, we would actually see that, but there is none. So what I did when I shot this image was I very deliberately overexposed it by 2.5 stops in the camera. So I like to shoot in manual so that I have full control over what I'm doing when I'm in the field. So I will walk outside from the ship as we're cruising through the ice. I'll look at what the light's doing. I'll set the exposure on my camera. I'll make a test shot and I'll look at the histogram, because the histogram on the back of the camera is the most important tool we have in digital photography today. In fact, if I actually had my way, it's the only thing the camera would show you. It wouldn't even show you the JPEG on the back. It should just show us the histogram, because the histogram tells us everything we need to know about the photograph. Basically what it is, for those of you who are not too familiar with the histogram, and I'm going to assume most people are not, is it's a visual representation of the tonalities that are captured in the photograph. So as we look at the histogram up here on the right-hand side, on the very far left, we have 0 or black. On the very far right, we have 255 and white, or pure white, and all the tonalities that are in between. So by looking at the histogram, we can very quickly see whether an image has been underexposed or overexposed or correctly exposed. Well, why is that important? It's important because the way your camera's sensor captures data in the field is non-linear. What that means is there's an awful lot better signal to noise ratio in the highlights than there is in the shadows. So if you underexpose a photograph massively by 2, 3, 4 stops, and then you try and correct that in post-production by increasing the exposure, what actually ends up happening is that you are amplifying the noise in the photograph. And you're amplifying a lot of noise because the signal to noise ratio is very poor in the shadows, where it's very good in the highlights. So that's why you want to expose to the right-hand side and then correct it in post-production by bringing the exposure down. When you do that, you're actually going to reduce noise in your image, and you're going to have captured the most possible data in the image as well, provided you haven't clipped the highlights. So if you do clip the highlights, meaning that you blow them out. And if, just by way as an example, if I increase exposure here, let's say by 2 stops nearly, you can see now that all of that area is clipped and blown out. If that had been the raw capture, that would be no good. I'd have to throw that in the rubbish bin. So you don't want to blow the highlights. Blowing the highlights is a very bad thing. And once you do that, you can't get them back. So it's a very good idea to, of course, try and expose towards the right-hand side, but not to clip the highlights. You can bracket if you're a little bit unsure in the field. That's one way to do it. Another is just to, as I say, look at the histogram, turn the blinkies on in your camera so that it tells you when you've clipped something in the highlights. And you know that you need to reshoot it again with a slightly less exposure. This is extremely important with snow and ice, because if I point the camera at basically what is an all-white scene or close to all-white scene in the snow, the camera is going to underexpose it. And the reason the camera is going to do that is the meter in the camera reads everything as 18% gray. So if you give it basically an all white field, it will try and send it gray or underexpose it. So exposure for snow and ice is critical to getting maximum texture and tone in your snow and ice. And if you can get maximum texture and tone in your snow and ice, you're going to get very, very good images, and images that are very, very interesting, because an image that has no texture and tone in the snow and ice is just flat white and extremely boring. So I wanted to talk a little bit about that at the beginning here, because, as I say, it's extremely important to get this right in camera. It's one of the things that I teach on all of my workshops in the field, exposing to the right. This is a bit of an extreme example because I want to demonstrate just how far you can push this and why it's worth doing. Now, you might also say, well, okay, this was shot at ISO 800. Why didn't you just shoot it at ISO 400 and expose it to the right like this? Well, the answer is maybe I wouldn't have had enough shutter speed to do that. So in this case, I needed ISO 800. I was at f5.6 at 1/250th of a second. I wanted 1/250th of a second because I was on a moving ship when I photographed this, and I wanted to make sure it was sharp and that I didn't have any motion blur from the movement of the ship through the ice. So let's talk about how we get the best out of what looks like an overexposed image. The very first thing I'm going to do, so this is reset to factory state. This effectively is how the camera captured the image. And for those of you who are interested, it was shot with the new Canon EOS R3. So the very first thing I'm going to do is correct what I did in camera, which was overexpose the image. So I'm going to just drop my exposure down by 1.8 stops. Okay, which is a fairly significant drop in exposure, but as you can see, all that beautiful detail that's now been pulled back into the image that was there, it was all there in the highlights. I just had to drop my exposure back to bring out all that wonderful texture that's in that piece of ice and in this foreground here. That's step one. And if that's all you do to your photograph, literally correct the exposure, you're already well ahead of having shot this meter as red in camera. And then tried to fix it in post-production later on. So I have dropped my exposure now by 1.8 stops. Basically what that means is I've captured the most possible data in the highlights. I've corrected that, which means I've lowered the noise as well in the image. So I'm now dealing with an image that even has less noise in it. If I'd gone the other way and I had underexposed this and needed to increase the exposure by 1.8 stops, I would now be amplifying the noise in the photograph, and that would be a bad thing. So this is optimal. Well, the next thing I like to do once I've corrected exposure in the image is to crop the image. I like to crop the image early on because it gives me a feeling of what I'm going to be working with once I start making other tweaks to the photograph. So there are a number of different ways we can crop the image. Excuse me. We could come up to the develop panel up here and we could click on this little icon. Or we could use a shortcut key. And the shortcut key in Lightroom for crop is the R key. So if we hit R, straight away we move into crop mode. Now, there's an overlay here that's popped up on the image, and you can actually change this overlay. This one is the golden mean. You can actually change this overlay to a number of different things depending on where you might want things to sit in the photograph. And you do that in the Tools menu. So you come up to Tools, Crop Guide Overlay. And then you have options here. You have grid, thirds, fifths, diagonal, center. Center was an addition that Adobe put in just for me on request, because I occasionally like to drop things dead center and break the rules in photography. Often with wildlife, I'll do that. In this case, we're not going to use center. We have a number of others here to choose from. I'm going to pick up thirds in this case. So that's just going to give me a guide when I'm cropping the image. So I like to crop in lights out mode. The reason I like to do that is just so that I have nothing distracting on the screen except for the image. And to get into the lights out mode and dim the lights in Lightroom, it's just the L, excuse me, the L key. Once we'll go to 50% brightness, and then once we'll go all the way down. So the very first thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to correct the fact that I didn't get the horizon straight in camera. So we'll fix that. Just like that. And that is pretty much all I'm going to do. I'm going to just take a little bit of that featureless sky out, not too much, just that much. So very, very gentle crop. And again, the L key for lights out. And again, you can choose which crop guide overlay you want to have when you're doing this. Some people like to work in the golden ratio, some work in the golden spiral. That was the golden, I'll go back to the golden spiral again. Crop guide overlay, golden spiral. I find this one also quite an interesting one, just by way of discussion on the golden spiral. It's a great visual representation of how the human eye takes an image in, or how we read photographs. So we usually come in and we go around in a circle and we finish on a point. And that's typically the way the human eye will read a photograph. So sometimes it can be very good to use this if you're having trouble, if the eye is having trouble resting somewhere in the photograph, then you can use this as a good way to see, okay, well, does this photograph work, and is the crop need work or not? Okay, so once I've cropped the image, then I'll start to get into some of my other adjustments. Now, Adobe has changed the game since I last did this webinar on post-production with snow and ice, in that they have given us far more powerful masking tools than we ever had before. And those masking tools allow us to be far more specific and precise with the adjustments that we make, in that we no longer have to make as many global adjustments. We can make them locally. So I am going to make some global adjustments first. The very first thing I like to do is to set a black point in my photograph. So that is, what is the blackest part of the photograph going to be? Excuse me one moment. So the way I like to set the black level, by the way, it doesn't matter in what order you make any of these adjustments in the develop module. You can fiddle away with dials in any order you like to your heart's content, because what happens is when you render out the file at the end, whether it's a TIFF, JPEG or whatever, under the hood, Lightroom will reorder all your adjustments into the best order for image quality. So you can actually fiddle around to your heart's content. You don't have to work top to bottom. And typically I don't. I like to jump around a little bit. So let's set our black level. So you can set black level a couple of different ways. This is the way I like to do it. I like to hold down the Option key, or Alt if you're on a PC. And if you click it and you drag down, you'll see the histogram move, and then you'll see clipping start to occur in the bottom. So that's obviously too much, but just by way of example, I'll then bring it back until I just have a tiny, tiny bit of black clipping. And you can see already how much more contrast we've now got in this foreground just by setting black point. So keep in mind, at this point, we've only made 2 adjustments to the photograph. Well, we've cropped it, but we've made 2 adjustments really. We've corrected the exposure for exposed to the right, and we've set a black point. So what's the blackest thing or the darkest point in the photograph? Now we need to set what is going to be the brightest point in the photograph. So that's going to be the whites. And I'm going to do that exactly the same way. I'll hold down the Option key, or again, Alt if you're on a PC, and drag that out. And you'll see the histogram expanding, and then it will start to clip. And I will just bring that back until I have no clipping. Okay? I don't have any clipping whatsoever. So now what I've done is I've expanded the tonality in this photograph quite significantly. So I've set a black point and I've set a white point. Now, in order to get the best texture and tone in the brightest highlights of this photograph, what I'm going to do is I'm going to drag the highlight slider all the way down to -100. And that's also going to bring the highlights down, but it's going to lock that white point. So it's going to give me that brightest point, but it's going to bring down the rest of the highlights. And that's going to give me a huge amount of tonality in this iceberg. If I go to before and after, actually, that's not the before and after I want. But if I did do a before, we'll come back to doing a before and after. I just want to be able to show this later on, how much tonality you can pull out with just 3 adjustments. So that's those 3 adjustments done. I don't need to make any sort of contrast adjustment to this photograph at all at this point. I've already made significant contrast changes to it just by setting a white point and a black point, and of course, reducing the exposure. What I do want to do, though, is I want to set a white balance. Now, it's interesting to talk about white balance. I always shoot on auto white balance, meaning I let the camera figure it out at the time, and then I will set it myself later on. But it is important to clarify that I am interested in pleasing white balance, not necessarily accurate white balance. I'm not a commercial photographer, I'm a nature photographer. So if I was shooting a commercial job for a large soda company and I needed to match a particular color red, for example, then I would be very, very interested in accurate white balance. But as a nature photographer, what I'm interested in is pleasing white balance. And what I mean by that is I don't want to neutralize the white balance, because that's going to remove all of the feeling in the photograph and all of the emotion that's there, all that cold feeling of being out in the snow and ice. So I'll show you how to do it, but this is not what I would do. So to change the white balance, you can either click on the white balance tool here, little eyedropper, and that's how I like to do it. Just click on that and then come over the image. And as you roll over the image, you'll see it brings up some numbers down the bottom. Those numbers are RGB numbers and they're percentages. So at this particular point, we have 84.4% red, 83.9% green, and 89.6% blue. So there's a little bit more blue there than red or green. Well, I know that. I can tell that because I'm working on a color calibrated display and my eye sees that it's slightly blue. Now, if I roll around and I look for a place where this is relatively close to neutral, I'll never get it exactly the same. This will do here. And I click it, that's going to warm up the image very significantly and remove a lot of the feeling that's in this photograph. In fact, it took away all of that cold feeling for me. It's now quite a cyan image. And although the sky is perfectly neutral, I don't like that cyan color cast. So I would undo that because I don't want that color cast. And then what I will do is I will find, again, a neutral spot in the image or close to neutral, and I'm watching purely the tint. Okay, so as shot, the Canon camera has said the tint is +13, so quite magenta. When I neutralize it, you can see that it almost went completely neutral on tint. It came down to +1. That's a little too cyan for my eyes. So I'm actually going to put that a little bit back towards magenta, and then I'll drop the temperature back down to keep that cool feeling in the image, because I want to try and maintain a lot of emotion in the photograph and make it and a lot of drama. Because anytime, and I speak about this a lot, especially on my workshops and in webinars, anytime you can create an emotional response in your viewer, you're going to create a successful photograph. And if someone sees it and they go, wow, that's amazing, that's obviously going to pump your tires up and you're going to feel good. They're going to think that's a great photograph. But if they turn around and then say, it makes me feel something, you know you've really got a winning photograph, because you've generated an emotional response at a much deeper level than just someone saying it's an amazing photograph. So we want to keep that feeling of cold. We want to keep that feeling of drama and not do away with that. Okay. All of that said, now we have now set a white balance that I am happy with, and we're going to move on. Now, this is the presence tab we're going to move down into now, which is texture, clarity, dehaze, vibrance, and saturation. Now, all of these are global adjustments, meaning that when I tweak one of these sliders, I'm going to be affecting the entire image. And I used to use these sliders a lot, but I now do many of these adjustments locally. I just had a question come through. I'm going to just segue for a second and address this question. The question is, are there other subjects besides the cold Arctic where you would do overexposure as well? For example, birds in the bush or jungle. The answer is yes. Anytime you can expose to the right without blowing the highlights and then correct it later in post-production, you are going to have a better result in terms of view of a lower noise floor and more detail, more fine detail in your photograph. So birds are a great example because birds have such fine detail in their feathers. So to absolutely get the very, very best from your raw file, you do want to try and expose it to the right. But if you are photographing birds in the bush or in the jungle, you do need to be very careful about bright highlights between trees and not to blow those out. So the answer is yes, but use caution. So I hope that helps with that question. Okay, let's come back to where we were. If I can get rid of this question panel so I can see what I'm doing. Yeah, so as I was saying, I don't use the presence tab very much since Adobe gave me such high-powered masking control. And that's what I want to show now. So rather than adding texture to this entire photograph, which would add noise to the sky, because the sky is basically a featureless, gray, cloudy sky, I can instead add texture just to the iceberg. Well, how do I do that? You come over to the masking tool, which is this little round tool here. Click that. Get rid of that. And then you go select, in this case, subject. And what will happen is the computer will try and figure out what is the subject in the frame. And there you can see it's picked up automatically the iceberg as the main subject in the frame. So it's done a pretty good job, not perfect, but pretty good job of showing what the subject in the frame is. Now, the very first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to rename that mask, and I'm just going to call it the iceberg. So I know for the future when I come back to this mask that that's the iceberg that I'm working on. Now, although we've got an automated mask selection here, and it's not perfect but very good, we can refine it a little bit. So I'm going to zoom in on it, and you can see here how it's just missed this area in here and a little bit here and a little bit here. So what you can do is you can select add, and you can select how you want to add. So in this case, I'm going to select brush, and I'm literally just going to paint. Just going to turn auto mask on so I don't go into the sky too much. I'm just going to paint in the areas where I want to make sure I hit as well. Now, this is quite processor intensive, so you need to have a reasonably fast computer to do this quickly and to be able to do it on the fly like this. This is a 2019 MacBook Pro I'm working on. My new one has not arrived as yet, but I just wanted to give you an example. You can see I've actually gone outside the iceberg a little bit there, so I'll just go to subtract, select brush again, and just brush away where I went outside into the sky. Now, the good thing about this is I don't need to be super precise here, because all I'm going to do is add some texture to this iceberg. Now, the shortcut key for turning the mask on and off is the O key. So the mask is still there as it is now, but I've just made it so you can't see it. But the O key, if you need to see what your mask is doing. I'm just going to zoom back in again. And what we're going to do is turn the mask off. So it lets me. Oops. As I say, this is quite processor intensive, so my computer is just struggling a bit to keep up here. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to just come down here and I'm going to add some texture to this iceberg. Not a lot, maybe just 12 points of texture. And what that's going to do is just going to help to bring out the fine detail again in this iceberg. I don't want to do any clarity whatsoever to this iceberg. And I think it's worth talking just for a moment about the clarity tool, actually. The clarity tool is a bit of a sledgehammer, and you need to be extremely careful with it. It's the biggest sin, overuse of it, I should say, is the biggest sin I see in most people who are beginning to process their images and just learning how to use Lightroom. What clarity really is it's a bit like a high-pass sharpening, where as you increase the amount, it's increasing the radius, and it can cause what's called clumping or digital clumping. And what that will do is it will actually obscure fine detail. So backing up from that, and by way of explanation, because it's very important to understand, sharpening, and we'll get to sharpening later, but I want to talk about it here because it relates to clarity. Sharpening in the digital domain works by darkening the dark side of an edge and lightening the light side. So if you have an edge of anything, in this case, the edge of an iceberg, the dark side and the light side, the more you darken the dark side and the more you lighten the light side, the more you increase the apparent sharpness of the photograph. And that's the way sharpening works in the digital domain. how many pixels either side of that edge get darkened or lightened is the radius. And that's very important to understand, because as you increase the clarity, significantly increase it. And let's do it to show you what I mean. Let's overdo it. So I'm going to increase it massively. What it's going to do, and you can see now, it's caused some very unnatural looking tonalities. I'll do it even more, actually, really overcook it. It's caused some very unnatural looking tonalities in the ice. And that's digital clumping, where there are too many pixels either side of an edge being sharpened, being darkened and lightened, and we're losing a lot of fine detail, and we're losing a lot of very subtle tonality. So the clarity slider is a very useful but very dangerous tool in snow and ice images. So very judicious use is recommended. In fact, I almost never used it. I can get better results with other tools. So in this case, all I'm going to do to this iceberg is literally what I've done, which is just apply a little bit of texture to the iceberg, just to bring out some really fine detail in that ice. And I'll show you how to get even more out of it as well. But I want to do another mask first. I'm going to create another mask, and we're going to select the sky. And again, the computer will automatically try and figure out what is the sky, and it will show it to us. And there you go. It's done, again, it's done a reasonable job, not perfect, but reasonable. And you can go through and refine this by subtracting and adding with the brush, with a linear gradient, with a radial gradient. There's a number of different ways to do it. I just wanted to show how selecting and masking on the sky works. I don't actually want to do anything to the sky in this case, so I'm just going to delete that mask. I do want to do something to this foreground, because we've got this beautiful checkerboard pattern going on that I think we can bring out more contrast in and make even more interesting. And I'm going to do that with a linear gradient. And the shortcut key for the linear gradient tool is M. Okay, so M is the shortcut key. And I'm just going to drag this up, so I'm affecting, excuse me, pretty much all the way up to the iceberg. I just want it to bleed off as we get to the iceberg, like that. Okay, and then we're going to turn that off, in terms of turning the mask off. Okay, now we're ready to make our adjustments in the snow and ice here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to play with contrast here, because looking at this particular checkerboard pattern, we've got some highlights, we've got some deep shadows, we've got some midtones. I think contrast will help a lot here. So I'm just going to bring up the contrast pretty significantly. And that other thing that I'm liking a lot here is that's also bringing out the reflection of the iceberg in the ice a lot as well. So I've brought that up quite a bit, and I'm also going to bring up, let's just see if bringing up the highlights in the foreground helps. If it's more mid-tone. I think it's more mid-tone. What about bringing that with the whites a bit? No, that's going to bring up the reflection too much. So a little bit of back and forth play here, just to find what's going to work at its best. And I think I might drop the shadows a bit in here. There we go. Now we're cooking the gas. I'm liking this quite a lot. Okay, so that's a local adjustment that I'm making to the foreground to really pump this checkerboard pattern, because that's the nice leading line into this iceberg. That's what's working for me. So often when I'm photographing, large icebergs like this in Greenland, this one was, we often don't have foreground outside of the ocean. So having some ice like this at the beginning of winter, when the sea is starting to freeze, really adds a lot to the photograph. In this case, not only the checkerboard pattern, but the fact that it actually picked up some reflection in the ice as well is fantastic. So I've turned that mask off, but I will just rename it to foreground ice, so I know what that mask is doing in the future. So we've got both our masks working for us here now. We've got our iceberg and we've got our foreground ice. Pretty much I'm done with masking at this point in this particular image. What I want to do now is come down. I'm going to completely ignore the presence tab, because I made the texture adjustments that I wanted to make to the iceberg in my mask. But I didn't actually add any clarity to the ice in the foreground. So we might just go back and do that very quickly, just to test that, because I didn't see how that would work. So as a local adjustment, remember, keep in mind, I'm only affecting this particular area at the moment that's shown in red with clarity. And I'm going to just put about 12 points of clarity in there. Again, a little bit of clarity goes a long way. Don't overdo it. And that's it. I'm going to leave that like that. And that means because I've made those adjustments locally where I want them in the image, I don't need to play around with texture, clarity, and dehaze. And actually, we'll come to dehaze separately. I'm going to talk about dehaze in another image because dehaze is one of the best tools we have for dealing with fog. When you're photographing icebergs in fog or anything in fog for that matter, even trees in the local park here in Melbourne in winter, dehaze is a great tool. I'll show you an example of how to use that. What dehaze was originally designed for, though, was if you look at these back mountains here that are off in the distance, they're quite faded and faint. There's not much contrast there. Dehaze was actually designed originally to bring out those mountains. But the problem with that, using the tool that way, is that's not the way the human eye sees a photograph. And it's not the way we see in real life. When we walk outside and we look at the distant mountains, excuse me, are very soft because they're at a distance. There's heat haze in the middle, there's ice crystals in the air. Our eyes just don't see that well at a distance. So if you correct that and you take all of that away and you make those distant mountains as pin sharp as the foreground, the image becomes very unnatural to the human eye because it's just not how we're used to seeing images. So be a little bit aware of that with the dehaze tool. That's what it was originally designed for, but a better use of it is for fog, and we'll come to that. Now, the tone curve. If you have made these adjustments correctly up here, meaning you've set your highlights, you've set your whites, your blacks, your shadows, your contrast, your exposure. If you've done all those things properly, you can completely ignore the tone curve. So the tone curve, like many things in Adobe land, they give us multiple ways to do the same thing. So you could add contrast to the photograph by adding an S curve to the tone curve. Sorry, adding an S to the tone curve. Typically, that's how we used to do it before we had all these individual sliders. Nowadays, it's really, in my opinion, a bit of a relic of the past. Some people who are used to working in tone curves still love it. I just find working in the sliders much easier and faster, and that's the way I find most people like to work these days. If you prefer the tone curve, there's nothing wrong with it. That's why it's still here. You can go ahead and use that. Let's come down to the hue, saturation, and luminance area, because this is an important aspect of dealing with ice and snow imagery. Typically, our images, although they're color, they're monochromatic in nature. So typically, we're going to be dealing with aquas, blues, greens, occasionally some yellows. If it's a sunset image, maybe some orange or red, but that's typically what we're dealing with. We're not dealing with a very extended color range. So in this case, any color adjustment I make to blue is probably going to affect pretty much the entire photograph because there's blue almost in the entire photograph. Excuse me. And you can test that by just clicking on this little button here. And this little button is called the targeted adjustment tool. And if you click on that and you scroll it over the image, you can see here in the HSL panel, it's showing a little gray box over blue because it's seeing that there's blue in that part of the photograph. And as I move it around, you can see it's not moving, it's just blue. So if I just grab that and drag upwards, it'll probably take some aqua with it. And there you go, you can see that. It's just increasing the blue saturation. It's also taking a little bit of aqua there. So that's how I like to set the saturation in my photographs. And at the end, I think a little bit goes a long way. Again, it's one of those areas that I see beginners make a lot of mistakes when they first start to process their raw photographs, is they oversaturate them. Less is often more in my experience with saturation. And I'll often even desaturate icebergs because they just look too blue. And people think they don't look real. Well, in this case, we'll leave just a little bit of saturation there. Maybe we'll just drop that back to 8 points. So you can see that all of these adjustments that I'm doing, other than the black and the white point, are quite subtle adjustments. This is not sledgehammer work that I'm doing here. It's very, very gentle. So let's come down to the detail panel. And again, this is a panel that's worth spending a little bit of time on and just talking about how the sliders work and what they do under the hood. I already talked about sharpening in the digital domain and how that works by darkening the dark side of an edge and lightening the light side to increase the apparent sharpness. And basically it's contrast. That is how it works. and you have a radius, which means how many pixels either side of that edge get lightened or darkened. The radius by default in Adobe Lightroom Creative Cloud is set to 1 pixel, meaning that 1 pixel either side of an edge gets lightened or darkened. Pretty basic stuff. There is a good reason to change it though. If you have an image that has a lot of fine textural detail, like this image, excuse me, we've got a lot of very fine textural detail in this iceberg, very fine textural detail in this sea ice. You can lower the radius below 1 pixel and really hone in on all that fine detail. This is the type of image where you want to do that. If I had an image of, let's say, maybe my daughter as a portrait, and she's got beautifully soft skin, and I didn't want to sharpen every single pore in her skin, I might increase the radius. So I might set the radius higher than 1 pixel. But most of the time for landscape imagery, if it's a landscape image with a lot of fine textural detail, so snow and ice or grass or trees or leaves or anything like that, you generally want quite a low radius. Now you can actually see it if you hold down the Option or Alt key and you drag the slider. My computer's just trying to catch up here. You can actually see the effect lowering and increasing the radius has on the image. So I know from experience that I'm going to want a radius around 0.7, 0.8 in that vicinity for this particular photograph. And that's going to ensure that I'm not losing any fine detail to clumping. Once I've set the radius, then I'll set the amount. And the most important thing to keep in mind when you are setting the sharpening amount is that you need to be zoomed into 100%. You cannot gauge this at 50%, 25%, or any other zoom magnification. You must be at 100%. And the reason for that is because of the way dithering works on the screen and the way the screen's resolution works. So you just have to be at 100% to see this. And sharpening is actually applied to the luminance channel, which means it has no effect on the color information in the photograph. So what Adobe do, which is very, very clever, is if you hold down the Option key or the Alt key while you drag the sharpening slider up, it will actually show you the photograph in black and white. And the reason it does that is because it's only applying sharpening to the luminance channel. So the color information is irrelevant. So it just lets you see better the effect of changing the sharpening slider. Now, all cameras are different in terms of how much sharpening an image will need from that camera because of the lens, because of the camera's sensor, because of the anti-aliasing filter, excuse me, in front of that camera's sensor, because of atmospherics, how much ice was in the air, or haze or heat haze or whatever else might have been present. So you need to judge this on an individual basis and build up your own experience with setting the sharpening correctly. An easy way to tell if you go too far is that you will start to see a halo around edges. And that halo is looks a little bit like snow on a TV. It's just where you see the edge just becomes very unnatural looking. So if you're starting to see that at 100%, that means you've basically gone too far. Of course, if you zoom in far enough, 200%, 400% on an image that's correctly sharpened, you will see a halo, but that's not a bad thing at 200 or 400%. It's only a problem at 100%. Once I've done that, once I've set the sharpening and I've zoomed into 100% to do that, I have set it globally, meaning that that amount of sharpening, in this case, 61 points with a radius of 0.8, is being applied globally to the entire image. Well, I don't want that. I don't want to sharpen the sky because that's just going to create noise. So we have a masking tool. And if I hold down the Option key and just drag up that masking tool, as I drag it up, you'll see black parts start to appear. And what's happening there is anything that's turning black is no longer being sharpened by the algorithm. So the correct place to set this is when there's basically almost no sharpening in the sky where I don't want it. There's a little bit, I'm going to bring it up just a little bit more till it just starts to go away. So I really don't want to pump noise into that gray sky. About there is fine. Okay. The other important point to note about sharpening is sharpening and noise reduction are interactive because we've spoken about how sharpening works. But the way noise reduction works is effectively digital smoothing or softening of edges. And therefore, if you need to apply some noise reduction to a photograph, you actually need to apply additional sharpening to compensate for, excuse me, the loss of sharpening of the edges. So it's a little bit of a balance in the scales with noise reduction. Now, this photograph was shot at ISO 800 on the Canon EOS R3, which basically means there is no noise. Any grain that actually is in this photograph is really fog or ice crystals that are in the air. And we'll have a look at that and how to deal with that once we finish with this photograph. But I don't need to actually apply any noise reduction to this image. I know from experience that at ISO 800, this camera has no noise. The other important thing to note about noise reduction is there are two types of noise in your photographs. That is luminance noise. Well, now that shows up mostly as grain, or what we would consider to be grain in a photograph, and color noise. And color noise shows up as blotching, typically cyan or magenta blotching. Now, the good news is that modern cameras have become so good that we almost don't see color noise now until we get up to ridiculously high ISOs. So you almost never have any reason to play with color noise reduction if you're shooting a modern camera. And by modern camera, I mean anything in the last 5 years. Even at ISO 25,000, there's basically no color noise in the Canon EOS R3 that I need to worry about. So I just don't worry about color noise anymore. Luminance noise, as I said, shows up as grain. That will start to make an appearance around about ISO 1000 in the Canon EOS R3. And then obviously the higher the ISO you go, the grainier it's going to become. But we have some fantastic tools for dealing with that nowadays. So I'll come to that as well. There is one more slider I haven't talked about here in the sharpening panel, and that is the detail slider. Now, the detail slider has two functions. I should stress firstly, actually, if you set the amount, radius, and masking correctly, and if the capture was good, you should never need to change the detail slider. You just shouldn't need to, because the detail slider, as you ramp it up more and more, it starts to act like a deconvolution type of sharpening or a de-blur filter, like you would see in Photoshop. So if you have a capture that's not quite sharp in some areas, the detail slider can help with that a little bit. But generally speaking, you're better off getting your capture right in camera because the detail slider, although it can help a little bit, it's no free lunch. Okay, excuse me. Two things I like to leave ticked by default in Lightroom when I'm working on images with ice and snow are remove chromatic aberration and enable profile corrections. Now, chromatic aberration, all lenses have chromatic aberration. Even my $20,000 600mm lens has some chromatic aberration in it. Whether you can see it or not at 100% is another issue. But it's a free lunch to tick this box. It doesn't cost you anything. And chromatic aberration shows up as fringing or color fringing. Typically, you'll see it on the edge of things like mountains, and usually as a red or purple fringe. Remove chromatic aberration will just take that out. And enable profile corrections will just fix any vignetting, any barrel distortion that the lens you're using might have. So again, enable profile corrections is not a free lunch. It is mangling pixels, but it's doing it in your favor, if you like, because it's removing barrel distortion and things like that. So unless I have a very good reason not to enable profile corrections, and occasionally I do, I will just leave that ticked. So, and it's picked up the lens that this was shot with automatically, which was the RF 24-105. We can just disable it, by the way, if you want to see the difference that it makes to the image. Very, very subtle. And you can see there's a bit of vignetting in the corners that's now showing up as clipping. So I'll just re-enable that and that will clean that up again. Okay. I want to do a quick before after. So let's just go back to the grid view. Let's create a virtual copy. So I'm going to right click on it, create virtual copy. When you're ready, computer. Doesn't want to create a virtual copy for me. There we go. And I'm going to take that virtual copy and I'm going to reset it to what we started with. So back to our original image. I'm only going to dial in the 1.8 of exposure correction so you can see the difference those other adjustments made. and how easily and quickly we were able to get this much detail. You can see here on the right-hand side, hopefully you can all see that on the webinar, how much detail, how much texture and tone we could get out of this iceberg with just a few very basic corrections in Lightroom. Now, if I'd been doing this at the normal speed I was doing it, and not demonstrating this, that whole process would take me less than a minute. It's extremely fast. The more you do it, the better you get at it and the faster you're going to become at it. But I find that typically for me in Lightroom, once I've made up my mind that this is the photograph I want to process, typically I am done with it in less than a minute, maybe 2 minutes tops, because I know how the sliders work. I can go through and make the adjustments very quickly. And what we're about to do now is bake the cake. So we've processed the raw file, but we haven't rendered it out yet. And I would say at the moment, when we do render this file out, as I said, we'll be likely baking the cake. There are a few things more we can do to it to make it even better. So at the moment, I would say we've processed it to the about 95% of its capability, but I really want to put the icing on the top and get the very, very best out of this photograph. So how do we do that? So I'm going to take it over to Photoshop. So photo editing in Adobe Photoshop 2023. And that will render out a TIFF file. I like to use, if we don't get a spinning beach ball of death, I like to use TIFF files, not PSDs. The reason for that is TIFF files are open source, they're non-proprietary. PSDs are proprietary to Adobe, and therefore they are, if Adobe ever goes away or decides it's had enough of the PSD format, we could be in real trouble. I'm just going to check this is rendered out properly. It has, great. And we'll just zoom out a little bit so we're full screen. That's all right. And I'm just going to shrink this down a little bit so that you can all see. Oops. I can't see my layers palette at the moment. I want to be able to see my layers palette. So I just need to shrink this down. There we go. Okay, so we've got our TIFF file here, which is, it's TIFF file. It's I'll just type that in a question. Someone just asked that question in the chat. TIFF, T-I-F-F. A 16-bit TIFF file is really all you ever need to maintain all of the detail that was in your rendered file. You don't really need to go to anything more than that. So how do we get the last little bit out of this image? I like to use a plugin by a company called Nick. People are saying they can't see Photoshop. Okay, let's see if we can fix that. Share. Okay, let's see. Hopefully now, can someone just type in that they can still now see Photoshop for me? I think everybody should be able to see that now. Brilliant. Okay. Where was I? Yes, Nick. So the Nick suite of plugins, you access it through Filter. So Filter, Nick Collection, and the one I'm interested in is called Color Effects Pro 5. I think I'm correct in saying that you can download the Nick plugins as a free 30-day trial. At least you used to be able to. I think you still can. I'm not 100% on that, but jump over to the Nick, which is owned by DxO, and you should be able to download a sample. Okay, so we've got it here in our plugins, and we have a number of filters down the left-hand side. The filter I'm interested in when it comes to working with snow and ice is one called tonal contrast. Just scroll down to it. And by default, there's a number of different options here. There's the default, strong, high pass, and softening. Now, like a lot of filters, the presets are awful. You need to reset them to 0 and then work with those presets from a 0 point of view. So I'm going to do that to show you how to do it, because then you can save it as a preset for future use if you're doing a lot of work with images with ice and snow. Now, keep in mind, we basically had finished processing this image. What we're doing now is really just putting the icing on the cake. So there are going to be very subtle adjustments to really bring out the best in this photograph. So let's just click on the default, and it will make the image look horrible and way overcooked in contrast. but that's okay. Over here on the right-hand side, you can see we've got all the sliders for tonal contrast. We've got highlights, midtones, shadows, saturation. We're just going to reset all of those to 0, which means that the image is exactly like it was when it came into Photoshop. Okay. Then what I'm going to do is set the sliders how I want them to be, not how the preset says they should be, because the preset is pretty awful. Let me just see if I can make sure that you guys are actually seeing this. I'll try sharing this out again. You should be able to see this now in Nick. Apologies for having to jump around on screen shares here. It's the way Zoom works. It doesn't like sharing the entire screen at one time. Okay, looks like you can all see that now. Again, if someone can't see that, just drop it in the chat. As I said, I've reset highlights, midtones, and shadows to 0. So the image is as it was when it came into Photoshop. And highlights is the first one I'm going to set. I'm just going to drag that up. We'll actually start from the bottom because it's going to be easier to see it in this case. We'll start with the shadows, which is primarily going to affect this foreground area. And if I just hit that quite hard, just see how much detail and contrast we just picked up. Excuse me, I'll reset that again so you can see it again. A lot. So you really can pick up an awful lot of texture with one click. I'm just going to drag it down. It was a little bit too much. Then I'll see what the midtones do for me. Again, I like to, the first I start to experiment, I like to go overboard and then drag it backwards. Midtones mostly affecting the darker parts of the iceberg and the back part of the ice. So I'll reset that and do it again. So just so you can see that again. Actually help bring out the reflection quite well in the iceberg. So I quite like that. So we're going to use a bit of that as well. And I know the highlights, it's only going to hit these brightest parts of the iceberg up here. So I'm going to use a very judicious amount of that. Okay, just 8 points. Okay, and then we'll just hit apply. What that's going to do is it will render that out if it hasn't just crashed on me. Here we go. I think I have lost my screen share though, so we'll just try and screen share this back to Photoshop. Okay, you should all be able to see Photoshop now with a new layer that's been created labeled tonal contrast. So if let's just get rid of crop overlay, we don't need that. If I just turn that layer on and off, you can see how that is increasing the detail, the texture, the tone in that foreground, and it also increasing the reflection in that iceberg. So I'm really liking how that's going on. One last thing I want to do to this photograph before I'm going to be done with it. That tonal contrast adjustment, although it's mostly affecting the foreground and iceberg, it is also affecting the sky and adding noise to the sky. And I don't want that. Again, I want that sky to stay nice and soft and gray. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to put a mask over this layer, which is this little button down here, like a washing machine. And that mask is just hidden that layer completely, meaning it's effectively not on or hidden anymore. So I'm going to invert that mask. To do that, the shortcut key to invert the mask is Command-I. Once I've done that, I can then brush in with the brush tool using white, brush in the effect where I want it. So what this is going to, again, you can see I'm not being super accurate here. I'm just using a nice soft brush and just brushing this in. And then you can just turn the layer on and off to see the difference. It's a magnificent tool for getting the most texture and tone out of your photographs. And this works equally well, by the way, if you just go down to the beach and photograph a white seagull against a dark sky. You don't need to be up in the wilds of Greenland photographing gigantic icebergs on the cusp of winter to be able to use these tools. This tool will work exceptionally well on any photograph that's got light, medium, or dark tonalities in it. So basically any image. It's an incredibly powerful tool. Tonal contrast is probably the filter that I use the most when I'm working on images with ice and snow. There is one more I want to show you that is also worth playing with, which is also part of the Nick features, and it's called Detail Extractor. And it can also be very, very good for bringing out detail in the iceberg. So let's just zoom in on the iceberg now to 100%. And I am really now happy with the tonalities in this iceberg, because we don't have jarring transitions between our highlights, our midtones, and our shadows. And that's what can make an image look extremely unnatural. So if we take, for example, if you can see that the zoom key tool there, where I'm just putting it on that part of the iceberg, the shadow part of the iceberg, the transition from those shadows as we come around the corner is very, very soft. That is critically important, because that's the way the human eye sees it in real life. If you overcook your tonal transitions and you compress them, you'll make the image look very, very unnatural, and you'll destroy your tonalities. And this will show up, if it shows up on the screen, it shows up even worse in a print. So getting your tonalities right is critically important. And that's it. Once I'm done with that, I just hit save to save the photograph, and I'm pretty much done with it. The image, as far as I'm concerned, is finished. What I will do, though, is I talked about detail extractor. I will just take it over to Nik again. So Nik Collection, Color Effects Pro 5 is where you find this. And that will then load the new plugin. I need to screen share that again. Okay, here we are back in Nik again. And we're going to find that filter, which is called Detail Extractor. There's about 30 odd filters in here. You can drop a star on one if it becomes a favorite. So we'll just select Detail Extractor. And again, I'm just going to reset everything at its default to 0. Once you do that, so you don't have to do that every single time, you can actually hit Save Preset and call it Detail Extractor 0. So you can just click one button, you can come over to your presets or custom, and there's Detail Extractor on the left-hand side saved at 0. So you can see that those are the two that I use the most. And that's just another way you can get more detail out of an iceberg is the Detail Extractor tool. So let's cancel out of that. We'll go back to screen sharing in Photoshop. And I'll just make sure that's saved, which it is. We'll close that image and we will go back to screen sharing in Lightroom. Okay, we're back to Lightroom. Okay, what I want to do now is I'm going to go back to the grid view in Lightroom, and we're going to take a finished TIFF file. So a finally finished file. We're going to compare it to our original file that had the exposure corrected, and you can see where we're at. Let's just zoom in on the iceberg and have a look at the iceberg. There's a difference. And that's my workflow for getting the best out of snow and ice images. And you'll find that workflow works just as well on wildlife as it does on landscape images. It's an incredible way to get the best out of your raw image. We are starting to run out of time. I've only got about 20 odd minutes, 25 minutes to go. So if there are questions, please just throw them up in the chat as I go, because I don't want to miss anything if people have got questions. I want to take an image that's got fog in it now and show you how to use the dehaze tool to get the very, very best out of it. So I'm going to reset this image. This was also shot in Greenland this summer. Very, very simple image. Again, you can see exposed to the right quite heavily, not clipped, and in a fog too. So I'm going to do this fairly quick, just because I've taken you through the workflow slowly. Now I want to take you through just a little bit more quickly and show the dehaze filter. The question was just asked, why do I use Nik in Photoshop rather than straight from Lightroom Classic? Good question. I'm a creature of habit. It's just the way I've always done it. There's no wrong way to do it. You can do it straight from Lightroom. The benefit to doing it in Photoshop is I have the power of Photoshop's masking tools afterwards. If I do it from Lightroom using Nik, I need to use Nik's control points, which is a way to drop to mask their masking method, and it's not quite as refined as what Photoshop answers. So that is why I prefer to do it in Photoshop. But you can, excuse me, certainly do it in Lightroom as well. In fact, I should actually show how to do that. You can just go to Photo, Edit in, and I think you pick it up in here once you load it up. I can't remember exactly because I just don't do it this way. But there is nothing wrong with accessing Nick from Lightroom. Nothing wrong with it at all if that's the way you want to do it. Okay, let's get back to this image, which is, I'm just going to correct the exposure a little bit, not too much. Okay, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to hit it with a bit of dehaze. And as I bring up the dehaze, you'll see the fog start to disappear. And if I zoom in, you're going to be able to see it even better. See how effective dehaze is in removing fog. It does an incredible job. You don't want to remove all of the fog because, again, remember what I was saying at the start of this webinar, the emotion in your photograph and the feeling that you create in the viewer is extremely important. If you take all of the fog away, you're going to remove that emotive feeling. So I don't want to take all of it away. I just want to remove enough that I can bring out the texture and detail on this iceberg. And that's quite a lot I've used there. I probably don't even need to use that much. I'd probably back it off a little bit. Because keeping in mind, that's the only adjustment I've made so far. I haven't set a black point yet. I haven't set a white point. And we can very quickly do that, just holding down the Option key. Let's set the blackest part of the image. Which is going to be that bottom left-hand corner. And then also what we want to be the brightest point in the image. Yeah. And then drag my highlights down as well, somewhere around there. So again, now I've set those, again, resetting dehaze, you can see what a difference it makes to bring out detail in the fog. So again, small amounts go a long way. I've seen this tool used extremely well by landscape photographers who are working in forests in fog. I think fog is wonderful. It's one of the most fantastic things to be outside photographing in. And when I have fog and the opportunity to photograph icebergs in fog, I'm as happy as a proverbial pig, because what it does is not only does it give you a fantastic feeling in the photograph, but it cleans up the background in the image beautifully. We had a very thick fog here when I was photographing this image. And as a result of that, I didn't have to worry about the background at all. I could just focus on what the image became about, which was about serenity, tranquility, the quiet nature of the ice, sitting in gentle water, etc., etc., etc. So one more tool I want to show that you're going to need to use when you're processing images with ice and snow, and that is denoise. And the reason for that is, so you use processing images that have fog in them, and that is denoise. And the reason for that is because fog is effectively water droplets and ice crystals in the air, and it can look like grain very, very quickly after you've made some post-production adjustments. So if I'm finished making my adjustments to this image, let's say we want to pump contrast just a tiny bit. I'm going to do this quite quickly because I'm running out of time. I'm going to do a little bit of sharpening. Again, I know what works for this photograph because I've experimented a little bit beforehand. So all of this soft gray area, this was also shot at ISO 400, by the way, which means there effectively is no noise in the image, but there's a lot of grain because of the fog. And that can become problematic. And that's why I want to show you how to fix that. So just a few very basic adjustments here. I'm not even going to do any local adjustments. I'm just literally going to take the image from here to Photoshop. By the way, I'm going to demonstrate here Topaz's denoise. But you could also access this from Lightroom as well. But again, I'm a creature of habit. I do it through Photoshop. So we will do it in Photoshop. I need to share to Photoshop. Okay, here we are in Photoshop now with our rendered TIFF file. And if you have an image that has noise in it, or you have an image with a lot of fog, and you've done some adjustments and you're finding now that you are suffering a little bit from grain, you can clean it up very easily. Go down to the Topaz denoise is the plugin. Again, I think Topaz have a 30-day trial where you can download it for free. Try it for 30 days, and if you like it, you can then buy it. I found it an extremely powerful tool for removing noise from photographs. I think it's far more powerful than the tool that's built into Lightroom. So let's jump over to Topaz denoise. I'll probably need to do a new share on this as well. I will also see that all of the Topaz plugins, whether it's Topaz denoise, Topaz sharpener, or Topaz, what's the other one they have, gigapixel. All of them are very computationally intensive. So that means that they require quite fast computers to make the best of. Okay. Well, here we are now, we're in Topaz denoise. Let me just segue for a sec before I start this. Brendan's just asked me, Topaz AI, how do I rate that product? Good question. I'm still experimenting with it. It's not really my cup of tea, I'm finding. I'm not that comfortable with the results I'm getting from it as yet. I don't think it's going to be for me. I need to experiment with it a little bit more. Perhaps ask me that question by email in another week, and I might have a better solution for you, or a better answer on that one. Okay, so here in Topaz denoise, we have basically a before and after. So we have the image on the original image on the left, the denoised image on the right. I like to work this way just so I can see exactly what I'm doing. Importantly, if you overdo this, if you apply too much noise reduction to your photograph, you're going to make the iceberg, in this case, or the subject, look like plastic. So you don't want to overdo it. You need to be very, very gentle. And by default, if I turn on the automatic system, it will almost always overcook it. It just applies too much noise reduction. It makes the iceberg look unnatural. I find a little bit goes a long way. So you have here a number of options to choose from: standard, clear, low light, severe, or noise, or raw. Typically, I let Topaz make that decision for me, but then I will always adjust these myself. Remember how I said that sharpening and noise reduction are interrelated? Well, they are, and it's shown up here as well because you have an enhanced sharpness tool. So basically, Topaz recognized that as you remove noise from a photograph, or as you soften it, you need to add some sharpness back. So experiment a little bit with this. I find a little bit goes a long way. Often as little as 6 points of noise reduction is all that's required in an image like this. And again, I'll just bring the sharpness slider way down because I don't need to overcook this. Okay, that's it. And once you've got it to the point where you're happy, you've got a before and after comparison, you can just literally hit apply. And Topaz will then render this out. And as you can see, it's processing the image at the moment in the top right-hand corner. It's going down quite quickly, but it's very processor intensive again. So if you're doing this on an older computer, you may even have time to go and get a cup of coffee. It can be quite slow. So this is a 3-year-old Mac. It's probably going to take the better part of 15, 20 seconds to process out this file, to remove the noise from the image, but it does do an outstanding job. So I think it's an excellent tool to have in your arsenal, your armory, and to be able to use. So let's just share back to Photoshop. Share. Okay, and it's actually rendered it out into the same background layer. I didn't have that set to render out to a new layer, which is how I would normally do it, because I like to be able to turn the layer on and off and just see the effect that I've made. But it's a tool I just wanted to quickly demonstrate because I think it's a good one to have in your armory. If you are starting to deal with noise, that's either the result of a very high ISO capture or the result of a lot of atmospherics where you've got ice droplets and ice and water droplets in the air. So let's just save that file, close that off. We'll jump back to Lightroom. We're going to wrap up very, very shortly. Back to the grid view. The question was just asked, how much RAM is recommended for this software? My answer to that is as much as you can get. In my Studio Mac Pro tower next to me here, I've got 96 gig of RAM. In the MacBook Pro, I ordered 64 gig of RAM. So the most I could get, because in my experience, these programs are very processor and RAM intensive. And particularly if you're working, as I am, often with tens of thousands of photographs, very quickly you can fill up the RAM. When I came home from 4 months of travel just now with, gosh, I think it was in excess of 40,000 images, to render those in previews of 1:1 on this very expensive Mac Pro next to me took nearly 12 hours. and it used every bit of RAM it had. So I think buy as much RAM as your wallet will allow, and you will be forever grateful when you're working with your photographs, because it just makes life fast and easy. So I think a lot is the simple answer. I know Adobe quite low numbers for RAM, but that's not my experience in reality. I think you actually need quite a bit. Let's just have a look. We've got a few minutes. If anyone's got any last questions, please drop them in the chat. Otherwise, I'm going to very quickly jump over to a Palace CAD image. And I'm going to take over the develop module. And because I haven't shown you anything with wildlife, I think it's worth talking about wildlife for a moment. And again, I'm just going to reset this image to how it was when I captured it. So again, you can see exposed to the right. This is, again, something I try and do all the time because I want to capture as much data in the best signal to noise ratio that I possibly can, because it's hard when you're out photographing in a remote area. You can't go back and reshoot. So you've got to get it right when you're there. And perhaps if I just go through this at real time, given I've only got about 10 minutes left, if I go through this at real time, how I would process this, just to show you how quick it can actually be once you get a feeling for the controls. So let's do that. No, I'm just going to the black point now in the widest part of the image. I'm going to drag down my highlights, increase the shadows in the cat quite significantly. Okay. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with a mask, select the subject. Okay, and that's quite computationally intensive, so it takes a moment. There you can see it's done a very, very good job of picking up the cat. Rename that. Turn that mask off. I'm going to increase the shadows on the cat even more. Really don't want its face in shadows, so just drag down the highlights a little bit on the cat too. And here's a trick for wildlife that works really, really well. If you use the K key, the shortcut K, you can then brush in on the eyes. And if you just increase your exposure on the eyes a little bit, you will really draw the viewer into the eye of the animal. And anytime you can help connect the viewer to the wildlife in the frame, you're going to have a stronger chance of getting an emotional response from the viewer. So anytime I've got eyes of an animal, I'm looking at the eyes of the animal to see, okay, can I increase the brightness a little bit in the eye to help draw the viewer into the image, help make an emotional connection with the subject. Human beings love eye contact, and we love it whether it's with another human being or whether we're making eye contact with an animal in a picture. So if you can make that easier for the viewer, you're going to make your photograph stronger. Now, those of you who know me, I'll just rename that mask bar. Think of it, rename that to eyes. Those of you who know me know I hate blue skies. I'm not a blue sky photographer. I detest them. Blue skies, in my mind, are for making postcards. So whenever I have a blue sky situation like this, I was fortunate to have it snowing, some soft cloud around, but I've also got some blue sky. Not really a fan of that. So I'm going to use the saturation tool, and I'm going to just pull the blue down so that it much more softly transitions into the grays and the whites in this image. Okay. I'm going to crop the image just slightly. Probably not like that. Just a little bit off this bottom corner. What I'm looking at here is I'm cropping the images, just cleaning up the frame. So there's just a little bit of distracting snow there in that right-hand corner. So I'm just going to crop that out just to clean up the frame a little bit. Now I'll go through, where am I up to? I'll go back to my mask on the cat. Not the cat, but the eyes. And I'll just add a little bit of texture to help with the fur. And then we'll come through and globally sharpen the image. And this was shot with the EOS 1DX Mark II before I went to the mirrorless R3 with a 600mm lens. So as you can see, even without any sharpening being applied, it's already, this image is pin sharp. Just the lens is of such a high quality. This is obviously a high frequency image because of all this very fine textural fur here in this Pallas cat. So again, I want a slightly lower radius, remember, because of all that fine textual detail. Just going to drag up sharpening amount just until I remove the inherent softness that's there in the anti-aliasing filter of the camera, and then some masking because I don't want to sharpen everything. Somewhere around there. Got a couple of dust spots here. So the shortcut to clean up dust spots is the Q key. Just going to quickly click on those to clean up those dust spots. We'll leave all the snow, obviously. Okay. And that's pretty much it. This was shot at ISO 800 on a 1DX Mark II, so there really isn't any noise in this image whatsoever, and it was correctly exposed. Enabling profile corrections on the 600mm lens is basically invisible. This is the case for all big, high-quality telephoto lenses, all the big whites from Canon, Nikon's best lenses, because at the telephoto end, the MTFs for these lenses are pretty much perfect. So there's almost never any change when you hit enable profile corrections. I can remove CA, chromatic aberration, because it's a free lunch. And I'm pretty much done with this image, which again, going almost at full speed, really probably only took me a couple of minutes. So very, very fast. If I wanted to take this image to the next level, again, I take it over to Photoshop or over to Nick's plugin, and I would work with tonal contrast just to bring out a bit more detail in this part of the snow here, where you can see there is detail. Here, it's very much out of focus on this side, in this big snowdrift. So there's no detail to get back there. And that's fine because the eye is not interested in that part of the frame. What I'm interested in is the cat, the snowfall, and the right-hand side. What I didn't do was set a white balance. Let's quickly set a white balance. I'm going to do it the same way I did it last time. Just pick a neutral target. And then I'm just going to tweak it to taste. It's a bit warmer than I'd like. I want to keep that cool feeling there. If I go too far into the cool, by the way, I'll get my blue sky back. So you'll see that as I go further back, I'll get my blue sky back. I don't want that. Somewhere around there. Works for me. One of the things to be aware of when you're working on the eyes of the animals, just to address a question that was in the chat that I missed before I wrap this up, is does it look overdone? The answer is, if you go too far, yes, of course, it will look overdone. The point, the way to do this so it doesn't look overdone, do it at 100%. Let's actually do it for the sake of the exercise. I'll come down to my mask on the eyes, deliberately go too far with it so that you know, like this, you've gone too far. And then what you can do is just back it off until it looks natural. And there, looks pretty good to me. And that's a great way. Don't ever be afraid to play with the sliders to go too far, because everything that you're doing here in Lightroom is what's known as parametric editing, meaning it's not mangling pixels. It's just creating a list of instructions for how the image is supposed to look. So every time you make a change to the slider, you change the instructions, you don't actually change the pixels. You're only starting to mangle pixels once you move over to Photoshop or to Nick, where you're actually working at a pixel level, which is why it becomes very important to work with layers so that you can delete a layer if you need to. But here in Lightroom, we don't need to worry about that. The editing is non-destructive. We're just creating a list of instructions for how the image is going to look when it's rendered out, and you can change that list of instructions anytime you like. So I think that's it. We'll wrap it up there for today, unless there are any last questions. If not, you are more than welcome to drop me an email. You can jump onto my website at www.jholko.com and grab my email address and drop me an email if you have any questions over the next few days as you try and put some of this into practice. I am switched to mirrorless. The question was just asked in the chat. There were 3 factors for me that made the change to mirrorless a no-brainer. The first was blackout-free shooting in the Canon EOS R3, meaning there's no mirror going up and down, so you can see a bird in flight coming towards you without any blackout. The second one was eye tracking, the ability for the camera to track the eye of the subject as it's moving around the frame. And the third point was focus points right to the edges. So those three things for me were a game changer. I held out changing to mirrorless for quite a long time, but those three things made it worthwhile and absolutely have made wildlife photography much, much easier for everybody. In fact, if you're just coming into wildlife photography, or you're just starting to dip your finger in the water with it, I think it's a great time, because what mirrorless has done is it's put 30 odd years of autofocus experience of the wildlife photographer in the camera and giving you the option to track the eye and not have to think about it. The camera is going to do it for you. You can focus instead on composition and exposure. Mirrorless has coped just fine in the cold for me. I took 2 EOS R3s to Ellesmere Island this March in winter, where I had, the warmest day I had was minus 32 degrees Celsius. We were intense camping, and the coldest I had was minus 52, I think it was. And I was out photographing in those temperatures all day. The only problem I had with my cameras was battery life. I was getting about an hour, hour and a half out of a battery in minus 45 degrees Celsius. But to be honest with you, after an hour and a half, I'm lying in the snow and ice. You need to go and run around a bit yourself, because it's just so cold when it's minus 45 degrees. So the mirrorless cameras have really come of age now. The EVFs in them are now so good that it's almost impossible to tell the difference between that and an optical viewfinder. They've become phenomenally good. I'm going to address one last question just to wrap this up. Why do I reduce the highlight slider? Which I've done a lot. The reason for that is because when I'm setting the brightest point in the photograph with the white slider, what is going to be the very brightest thing, quite often it's also dragging up a whole lot of other highlights to be brighter than I want them to be. So by bringing that highlight slider down to minus 100, I can even that out. And then if I want more texture and tone in those highlights, I can do it with tonal contrast in Nik. So that's why I do it that way. So there you go. That is the webinar for today on processing images with ice and snow. Thank you very, very much for your attendance. As I said, if there are questions, please either drop them in the chat or email them to me. Perhaps email them to me now when we're finishing up, and I'll do my best to address them. I'm here in the country for just another 10 days before I head down to Antarctica for an expedition for emperor penguins. Looking forward to that. So thanks again to BenQ. Thank you very much for them for putting on this webinar for this evening. And also thank you to all of you for attending and listening to me talk for an hour and a half about processing images with ice and snow. I'm extremely passionate about this topic. As you can probably tell, it's very near and dear to my heart. Photographing in the polar regions is really what I live for. When I'm not in the polar regions, all I really can think about is getting back there. So I hope this has helped you a little bit. I hope you can apply it to some of your photography, and hopefully you'll do that on a BenQ monitor. Okay, thanks so much.
Thank you again, Joshua, for this wonderful session. We hope everyone has enjoyed his return and was able to, gain some further insights as well with this extended session. I'd also like to thank our attendees for taking your time out to join us. This session was also recorded, and I'll be sending out the details tomorrow, where you can rewatch it again on our BenQ Australia YouTube channel. Now, if you had any other questions that were not answered, you can also visit our BenQ live chat at benq.com/en-au, or you can email us directly, and we can also forward your questions to Joshua himself. So bqaumarcom@benq.com. And if you have any other technical questions about our BenQ monitors, you can also check out our reseller partners down the bottom here. Thank you again, and don't forget to fill out the quick survey so we can also, get your feedback as well regarding next topics that we can have with Joshua. So that's all for tonight. Thank you.
Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Joshua. Bye-bye.